He didn't draw attention to himself. Every morning, the old man arrived at Dawnfall Station before the first train. Pause 1 second. With slow, deliberate movements, he swept the platform, wiped down the benches, and trimmed the stray weeds by the tracks. In his weathered hands, he carried a simple walking cane, dark polished wood with a faint metal insignia embedded near the handle. Most people never looked twice at it, or at him. To them he was just the quiet station janitor, a nameless figure in a faded blue coat and cap who mopped floors and hauled luggage carts. For years, commuters rushed past without a greeting. Teenagers with headphones slung low would brush by as if he were invisible. Businessmen absorbed in their phones nearly ran him over in a hurry to catch the 7:10 train. Sometimes a child would stare curiously at his cane's shiny emblem, but parents always pulled them along before he could offer a kind smile. He had learned to expect no thanks. If a trash can was suddenly empty or a spilled coffee quietly cleaned up, no one noticed who did it. Day in and day out, he performed small acts of upkeep with the pride of someone doing a far more important job. And perhaps it was important, at least to him. The station manager knew him as Walter, but even she rarely spoke more than a passing morning. To everyone else, he was practically part of the furniture, just a quiet old man keeping the station neat, ignored, forgotten. Yet Walter never complained. He moved with a calm diligence, polishing the brass clock frame or gently helping an elderly passenger find a seat, all without a word unless spoken to. If someone thanked him, a rare occurrence, he would nod politely and tip his cap, saying only,
"Just doing my job."
There was a loneliness in his eyes sometimes, especially when he watched the evening train roll out and the platform emptied, leaving him alone with echoes of footsteps. But if you looked closely, not that anyone did, you might see a certain poise in the way he stood, a bearing far straighter than his years. At night, when Walter locked up, he would pause and gaze down at that metal insignia on his cane, running a calloused thumb over it. Sigh. Then he'd turn off the lights one by one and shuffle home down the quiet road by the tracks. For 40 years, this had been his life. An old soldier working in a train station? Some might have guessed, seeing his age and the hint of discipline in his movements. But no one ever asked. Walter's past was as silent as the empty waiting room after midnight, and he kept it locked away just as tightly. That all changed on a late summer afternoon. The 3:15 train was due in, carrying a handful of visitors and locals. Among those waiting on the platform were a few regulars. Mrs. Thompson with her weekly groceries, the college kid who always fell asleep on the bench, and a couple of teenagers goofing around by the timetable board. Walter was at the far end of the platform, quietly collecting candy wrappers someone had left on the ground. The distant horn of the approaching train sounded, and the small crowd edged forward. As the train pulled in with a screech, Walter stepped back against the wall out of habit, making himself as unobtrusive as possible. The doors opened, and passengers began to step off. Families reunited with hugs, travelers stretched after the long ride. One of the last to step off was a young man in desert fatigues, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. His posture was straight despite the exhaustion on his face. Second Lieutenant James O'Connell had finally returned home from his deployment. He took a deep breath of hometown air, relieved to be back on familiar soil. James scanned the platform, expecting to spot his parents eagerly waiting. They weren't immediately visible in the small throng. Instead, his eyes were drawn to something else, a subtle glint of metal in the afternoon sun. It came from the end of an old man's cane a few yards away. The young soldier's gaze sharpened, instinct honed from months abroad where noticing details was a matter of life and death. He saw the five-pointed star medal embedded in the cane's handle, faded blue ribbon design wrapping around the wood. It took him a moment, but his heart skipped when he recognized what it was.
No, it can't be,
he thought, pulse quickening. That insignia was unmistakable to any soldier, Medal of Honor. James's breath caught in his throat. Here, on a cane at a sleepy train station, it felt completely out of context. He blinked twice, thinking maybe it was a replica or just a similar star. But as the old man turned slightly, James saw a small eagle above the star and a wreath design. This was no replica. It was the real deal, the highest military honor in the nation, casually attached to an old walking cane. For a second, James just stood there in disbelief. Long pause. The noises of the busy platform, the laughter, the shuffling feet, the hiss of the train brakes, all faded under the thunder of his heartbeat in his ears. Could it be that this quiet old janitor was a Medal of Honor recipient? How could that be? Who is he? The old man, oblivious to the young soldier's stare, finished tying up a trash bag and turned to hoist it onto his cart. He winced slightly as he lifted. His knees weren't what they used to be. The movement jostled his coat enough to reveal a hint of a scar on his neck and a glimpse of a lean, sinewy forearm, not typical of frail old age. James stepped forward instinctively, his duffel dropping to the ground. He suddenly felt a rush of respect and shame. Respect for the man in front of him, and shame that he, like everyone else, had been about to walk right past this living legend. He approached slowly, almost on autopilot. As he neared, the insignia on the cane gleamed again. There was no doubt now. James's mouth went dry as he struggled to find his voice. He swallowed and cleared his throat, quietly said,
Sir. Excuse me, sir.
Walter turned around, slightly surprised to be addressed. In front of him stood a young man in uniform, eyes wide and face suddenly earnest.
Can I help you with something?
Walter asked gently. His voice was gravelly from age and disuse, but polite. James didn't answer right away. His eyes were on the cane now, up close. Yes, a Medal of Honor indeed, set into the wood, perhaps as a custom cane handle. Up close, he noticed something else, faint engravings along the side of the cane, a date, May 1970, and a location, Quang Nam. The young soldier's mind raced. Quang Nam, 1970. That was during the Vietnam War. He recalled a story, a near legend told during training about an operation in Vietnam. A small unit ambushed, a desperate defense, and an incredibly brave sergeant who held a narrow bridge against overwhelming odds to save his platoon. That sergeant had been awarded the Medal of Honor post-retirement decades later, when records finally recognized his actions. Could it be? James felt a chill. The platform around them carried on in a blur of motion, but a few people began to notice the unusual scene. A young soldier standing rigidly in front of the old janitor, apparently at a loss for words. Mrs. Thompson paused with her grocery cart. The teenagers stopped joking and nudged each other to look. and the station manager peered out of her office curiously. James finally tore his eyes from the cane and stood at attention. With a crisp motion, he brought his hand up in a salute. Pause 1 second.
Sir,
He said, voice clear and carrying now.
I just want to thank you for your service.
Walter's eyes widened in astonishment. No one had saluted him in decades. The sight of this young man snapping to attention, for him, nearly made his heart stop. At first, he wasn't sure what to do. He hadn't worn a uniform in over 40 years. Slowly, uncertainly, Walter returned the salute, raising a trembling hand to his brow out of instinct more than thought.
At ease, son.
He murmured, voice thick. Around them, the world seemed to slow. Conversations hushed. One by one, people on the platform realized something was happening. A subtle, reverent silence fell over the immediate area. The teenagers stood up straight, confusion and curiosity on their faces. Mrs. Thompson let go of her cart, one hand moving to cover her mouth. The station manager stepped fully out of her office, heart pounding as she took in the surreal tableau. Her janitor, the quiet old Walter she'd known for years, exchanging salutes with a uniformed soldier half his age. James relaxed from the salute, but remained respectably straight-backed. He extended his hand.
Lieutenant James O'Connell, United States Army.
He introduced himself, voice respectful. Walter switched his cane to his left hand and shook James's hand with his right. His grip was firm, belying his age.
Walter! Just Walter!
The old man said softly. He was never one for titles. Up close, James could see the faint sheen of tears in the old man's eyes that weren't there a moment ago. Walter cleared his throat, fighting the emotion that threatened to choke him. Emotional. He had never expected anyone to recognize that piece of metal on his cane. It had been so long since it meant anything to anyone but him.
Sir, if you don't mind me asking,
James began, still shaking the old man's hand.
is that emotional? Is that a Medal of Honor on your cane?
His voice carried a mix of awe and disbelief that he couldn't hide. Walter glanced down at his cane, almost as if he'd forgotten it was there. He nodded once, slowly.
A long time ago,
He replied. His words were humble and quiet, but in the listening silence of the platform, they were perfectly audible. A collective gasp, ever so soft, came from those who had been drawn to the scene. A murmur rippled through the small crowd now gathering. Murmur,
Medal of Honor?
someone whispered.
That old guy.
Another muttered under their breath, eyes wide. James felt a surge of emotion at having it confirmed. Here he was, standing face to face with a man who had earned the nation's highest honor, a man who likely performed acts of incredible valor and yet spent his days sweeping a train station in anonymity. He realized he was still holding Walter's hand and gently released it, composing himself. By now, a few others had stepped closer. Among them was an older gentleman who had been waiting for a train. Himself, a Vietnam veteran based on the faded unit cap he wore. He looked at Walter with astonishment.
Wait, I knew you looked familiar.
The man said in a hushed tone.
Could you be the Sergeant Walt Henderson that saved those men in Quang Nam?
Walter's eyes shifted to the man speaking. He gave a reluctant half-smile and a little nod.
I did serve in Quang Nam, May of 1970.
The older veteran inhaled sharply.
I'll be darned. They told stories about you at the VFW hall, you know.
He said, voice trembling with admiration.
I never put it together. You're a damn hero, sir.
He stepped back as if beholding something extraordinary, then slowly began to clap one gnarled hand against the other. It was a solitary, gentle clap at first, echoing in the hush. James stood beside Walter, practically glowing with pride by proxy, and gave a nod to the veteran. That single clap seemed to break the spell for the rest of the onlookers. Mrs. Thompson, tears in her eyes, started clapping as well, her groceries forgotten. The teenagers, faces now solemn and respectful, hesitated, then joined in, applauding uncertainly at first. The sound grew as every person on the platform, a dozen, then 24 people, turned toward the quiet old janitor who had been among them all these years and offered their gratitude the only way they could in that moment. Some clapped, some simply stood with respectful gazes. A few placed hands over their hearts. Walter was overwhelmed. He stood in the center of this, shoulders hunched slightly in his old coat, looking around in disbelief as more and more faces turned toward him with admiration. His lips parted, but no sound came out. For a man who had lived so much of life in silence, even this wordless recognition was almost too much. He managed a shaky smile and tipped his cap in humble thanks, eyes glistening. Inside memories churned, faces of brothers in arms long gone, moments of bravery and loss that he never spoke of, all flooding back with each beat of the applause. He blinked rapidly, pressing those feelings down, but one tear escaped and traced down his weathered cheek. James stepped to Walter's side, almost like an honor guard, and gently placed a hand on the old man's back. The young soldier's own eyes were wet now. He'd dreamed of homecomings and parades, but this quiet moment of honoring a past generation felt far more profound.
Thank you, sir,
He said again softly.
for everything.
Walter looked at the lieutenant, then at the crowd. He finally found his voice rough and low.
Thank you. Thank you all. But I'm just an old man now.
He insisted, with a modest shake of his head, soft chuckle, as if to downplay the significance.
I was just doing my duty back then. No need to fuss.
The station manager, Ms. Patel, stepped forward through the small crowd. She was holding her hands nervously, and her face was flushed with emotion.
Walter, why didn't you ever tell us?
She asked, almost apologetic.
All these years, we never knew.
Walter gave a little shrug.
It was a long time ago, ma'am. Different life.
He gazed down, a little embarrassed by all the attention.
I hung up my uniform a long time back. Figured it was better left that way.
A middle-aged man who had been waiting for a train approached and extended his hand to Walter.
Sir, my father fought in the same war. If he were here, he'd shake your hand too. May I?
Walter nodded, and they shook. One by one, people came up, not too close, respectful of his space, but enough to offer a word or a nod. A young mother holding a toddler balanced on her hip stepped forward and said, voice quiet but clear,
"Thank you, soldier."
The little child in her arms, not fully understanding, waved a tiny hand at Walter, and he couldn't help but smile wide at that. Amid the small gathering, the old veteran from earlier, who recognized him, approached with a firm salute of his own. Walter returned it gently.
Welcome home, Sergeant.
The fellow veteran said, eyes shining. In the midst of this, James's parents finally arrived on the platform, having been caught in traffic on the way. They hurried in, worried they'd kept their son waiting, only to find him standing next to Walter and a crowd around them. James's father, Mr. O'Connell, himself a retired Army mechanic, immediately sensed something significant.
"What's going on?"
He whispered to a neighbor.
"That janitor. Turns out he's a war hero.
The neighbor murmured.
Medal of Honor from Vietnam."
James's father's eyebrows shot up. He removed his cap out of respect and guided his wife gently forward to see. James saw them and beckoned them over.
Dad, Mom, come meet Mr. Henderson.
Walter turned to the approaching couple and straightened up as much as his old spine would allow. James's father, an ordinary working man who'd served a few years, looked awestruck and then firmly shook Walter's hand with both of his.
"Sir, it's an honor, more than an honor, to meet you,"
he said, voice trembling with sincerity. James's mother nodded respectfully, offering thanks and dabbing her eyes with a tissue as the emotion of the moment caught her too. For a short while, Dawnfall Station was transformed. The busy bustle of travel had given way to a spontaneous tribute. No train announcements came over the PA system. Even the station master had silenced them briefly, as if the station itself paused to pay respect. The sun dipped lower, casting a golden glow over the platform, as if nature itself approved of this long-overdue recognition. Eventually, the intensity of the moment gently subsided. People knew they had witnessed something special and felt reluctant to disperse, yet life must move on. The next train's arrival was imminent, and some had connections to make. One by one, with final nods or waves at Walter, the crowd began to resume their travel routines. But they did so reverently, quieter, kinder than before. The teenagers who had been laughing loudly earlier now walked past Walter with polite smiles, one even offering a respectful,
Have a good day, sir.
which was something he'd never heard from them before. Mrs. Thompson picked up her grocery cart, gave Walter a gentle pat on the arm, and said,
"God bless you, dear."
before leaving. The middle-aged man who'd shaken his hand earlier said a warm goodbye, and the young mother who'd thanked him guided her child to wave once more as they departed. Ms. Patel, the station manager, lingered, clearly moved. She told Walter to take the rest of the day off, on full pay.
And tomorrow,
She added,
we're going to talk about doing something special. Maybe a little ceremony if that's all right with you.
she smiled.
The town should know who you are.
Walter flushed and shook his head humbly.
That really isn't necessary.
He began, but Ms. Patel raised a hand kindly.
It's not for you, Walter. It's for us, to show our gratitude. Please.
He paused, then nodded softly, accepting that this recognition was as much for his fallen brothers as for himself. James and his family were among the last to leave, since they had come to pick him up but got swept into the event. James picked up his duffel bag, and before departing, he turned to Walter one more time.
May I visit you sometime, sir? I'd love to hear about your service, if you're willing to share.
His tone was hopeful, but understanding that it was entirely Walter's choice. Walter looked at the earnest young face, In James's eyes he saw not just curiosity, but genuine admiration and a promise to remember. It touched something deep inside. He gave a gentle nod.
I'd like that, son.
Then, in a rare show of humor, Walter added with a faint grin, soft chuckle, I'm at this station most days anyway. You know where to find me. They both laughed quietly. James nodded, and sensing it was okay, gave the old man a final brief hug, a gesture of respect, brotherhood, and perhaps filling in for all the gratitude Walter never received in the past. Walter patted the young man's back kindly.
Welcome home, Lieutenant.
Walter said softly as they parted. James smiled.
Thank you, Sergeant,
he replied, emphasizing the title. With that, James slung his duffel over his shoulder and walked off with his parents, glancing back over his shoulder at Walter, still standing there by his cleaning cart and cane. In that moment, James felt lighter than he had in a long time. He had come home to find a hero he didn't know he had. When the platform finally emptied, Walter stood alone once more in the quiet golden light. He exhaled a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Sigh. The station was as silent as ever, but something fundamental had changed. He looked at his cane, at the Medal of Honor insignia that had been his silent companion for so long. Gently, he rubbed a thumb over it again, but this time there was no sadness in the gesture. Instead, there was a sense of relief, even joy. People knew. Not because he wanted fame, he never did, but because it felt like the memory of those days, of his comrades and their sacrifice, was finally respected and shared, not just locked in his heart. That evening, as Walter closed up the station, a few townsfolk lingered by the exit, smiling at him in a way they never had before. The newspaper editor had caught wind and was among them, politely asking if he might stop by tomorrow for an interview. The mayor's assistant left a note inviting Walter to the next town council meeting for a special acknowledgment. It was all a bit overwhelming. Walter simply nodded and accepted the notes with trembling hands. Walking home along the dusty road by the tracks, Walter didn't feel as alone as he used to. Word had spread quickly through the town's grapevine. A couple driving by in a pickup truck slowed down to wave at him. They'd heard the news.
thank you for your service.
The driver called out sincerely. Walter raised his hand in thanks, a lump in his throat, emotional. Two neighborhood kids who often played near the station ran up to him at the corner of Maple Street. Usually they paid him no mind, but tonight they approached shyly. One held out a small wildflower.
For you,
The little girl said.
Mom said you're a hero.
Walter knelt with some effort, accepted the flower with utmost care, and smiled.
Thank you, young lady.
He replied gently. Her older brother gave a clumsy salute, clearly coached by someone. Walter's laugh was warm as he returned the salute with perfect form.
You two be good now.
He said, and they scampered off, giggling. When he entered his modest house, Walter set his cane by the door and hung up his cap. The house was quiet, as always, but he felt a weight off his shoulders that he hadn't realized he was carrying. He sat in his favorite armchair, the evening paper untouched on the side table, and allowed himself to replay the day's events in his mind. In the dimness, he whispered a few names, the names of the brothers he lost on that day in Quang Nam, names he hadn't spoken aloud in years. He closed his eyes and could almost imagine them there with him, grinning and clapping him on the shoulder like they used to. For the first time in a long time, Walter felt at peace. He had lived believing that chapter of his life was buried in the past, but recognition had found him, quietly and without warning, on an otherwise ordinary day. And it felt right, not for glory, but for remembrance. The next morning, Dawnfall Station buzzed with unusual energy. A couple of local reporters milled about, cameras in hand. Town officials arranged a small makeshift podium near the waiting area. Commuters who usually kept their heads down looked around eagerly, sensing that today's train ride came second to something more important. They spotted Walter coming up the path, cane in one hand, thermos of coffee in the other. He hesitated when he saw the gathering, not one for fanfare, but Ms. Patel hurried over and gently guided him forward. What followed was a heartwarming ceremony. The mayor gave a short speech about duty and humility. A representative from the local Veterans Association presented Walter with an engraved plaque and simply said,
Welcome home, Sergeant Henderson.
James was there, too, in his dress uniform, having insisted on standing with a few local ROTC cadets as an honor guard. In front of everyone, James stepped forward, saluted Walter again, and pinned a fresh ribbon on his coat, a small-town token of thanks. Walter accepted everything with quiet grace, though his hands trembled from emotion more than age now. He even shared a brief recollection, something he never thought he'd do publicly, about how he wasn't a hero, that he only did what any of his brothers would have done. For him, his words were simple, but they carried the weight of truth. Many eyes glistened with tears as he spoke. By midday, Walter returned to his usual tasks, but nothing was quite the same. Wherever he went in the station, people stopped to shake his hand or just say a respectful, "Good afternoon." Some who had never noticed him before were now offering to help carry his supplies or insisting he sit and rest. It was almost comical to him. He had managed alone for years, and now suddenly he had helpers. But he appreciated the kindness. The teenagers who loitered after school even took turns volunteering at the station that week, painting over graffiti and cleaning up, inspired by the man they had once overlooked entirely. As days passed, the initial excitement settled, but the respect remained. Walter went about his work with the same quiet dedication, but now nearly everyone knew his name. He couldn't step onto the platform without someone calling out, "Morning, Walter," or "How are you today, sir?" The little wildflower from the kids sat in a cup of water at his station desk, a reminder that people cared. In the corner of the station's lobby, a new framed article hung on the wall. The local paper's feature story about Walter, the watchman of Dawnfall Station, detailing his heroics in Vietnam and his decades of humble service afterward. Underneath it, the station staff had set up a small display case with a replica Medal of Honor on a blue ribbon, a folded flag, and a photo of Walter from his Army days. He had dug one out after much persuasion. He had grumbled that it was unnecessary, but secretly, seeing the young version of himself in uniform displayed for others gave him a quiet pride, not in himself, but in the reminder of the men he served with. One crisp autumn morning, a month after the encounter, Walter sat on his bench during a break, cane resting across his lap. A few commuters were nearby, sipping coffee and chatting. Walter gazed at the sunrise over the rails, lost in thought, when he heard someone approach. It was Lieutenant James O'Connell, in civilian clothes now, coming to catch the train into the city for a short trip. James had made it a habit to swing by the station whenever he could, sometimes just to check in on Walter. James sat next to him on the bench.
How have you been, sir?
He asked. Walter smiled at the young man, a genuine smile that reached his eyes.
Can't complain,
He said.
This old station's been treating me well.
He gestured around at the tidy platform, the flower pots someone had set out, the friendly faces.
Things have changed. For the better.
James nodded. He leaned in slightly and said,
You know, they say around town that you're the reason a lot of folks have started being kinder to each other. Ever since that day, it's like everyone got a reminder of what honor and humility look like.
He chuckled.
Even those teenagers formed a volunteer group to help veterans in the area. Can you believe that?
Walter shook his head in wonder.
All I did was my job.
He murmured. James looked at him thoughtfully.
Sometimes just being who you are is enough to inspire people.
The old man looked down, a bit bashful. He wasn't used to being seen as inspiring. But he patted James on the shoulder.
You and your generation, you're why I'm hopeful.
Walter said quietly. Seeing a young soldier show respect to an old one, it means the memory of what we fought for, the sacrifices they'll live on. That matters more than any medal. James felt a lump in his throat and simply nodded. In the silence that followed, the train whistle sounded in the distance. As the train rolled in, James stood and shouldered his bag. He extended his hand one more time, and Walter clasped it firmly. "See you soon, son," Walter said.
You will, sir. I promise.
James gave a firm handshake and then, unable to resist, a quick salute as farewell. Walter returned it crisply, eyes shining. The young soldier boarded the train and, through the window, watched Walter on the platform as the train pulled away. The old man stood, not just as a station janitor seeing off a passenger, but as a sentinel, a quiet guardian of countless stories and sacrifices. James watched until the figure blurred from view, a profound gratitude warming his chest. He knew he'd just witnessed something rare, a living testament to the ideals he held dear. Back on the platform, Walter resumed his routine, but with a heart lighter than it had ever been. He picked up his broom and started sweeping the same platform he'd swept for years, only now the dust seemed a little less heavy. A couple walking by greeted him, and he greeted them back by name. Names he had learned because now people talked to him. In the reflection of the station's window, Walter caught sight of himself, an old man with a cane, doing a simple job. He also saw, superimposed by memory, a young soldier in a jungle helmet standing resolute. He gave that ghost of his past a small nod as if to say, "We made it," rising, falling, and rising again. That was the journey of his life, and here he was, still standing, and not alone anymore. The station that had been just a workplace became a community, and the people who rushed by became neighbors and friends. He walked to the end of the platform where the American flag fluttered on a pole in the morning breeze. Taking off his cap, Walter placed it over his heart, looking up at the flag against the clear sky. It was something he did in private every morning, a silent salute to the country he loved and the comrades he lost. But today, a few passers-by noticed and quietly stopped, placing hands over their hearts as well, joining him in that moment without a word. Walter realized something then. Being seen wasn't so bad. Not when it meant the values he lived by were seen too. Not when it meant the story of those who never made it home was being quietly told in the way people now treated each other. He had never wanted accolades. He only wanted a world where people remembered why guys like him had fought it all. For kindness, for freedom, for each other. Standing there in the morning sun, the old veteran felt a single tear of pride run down his cheek, but he didn't wipe it away. He let it fall. It was not a tear of sorrow this time, but of fulfillment. Sometimes the greatest heroes live among us in plain sight, wearing janitor uniforms or waiting at train platforms, carrying untold histories in their humble silence. And sometimes all it takes is one attentive soul, like a young soldier coming home, to notice a small insignia and with it unlock a legacy of valor that inspires an entire community. So now I ask you, have you ever crossed paths with someone ordinary only to discover they were anything but? Someone who carried a hidden greatness, a story of sacrifice or courage, without ever saying a word. Share your experience in the comments. Tell us about your quiet hero. Because here on The Human Stories, we believe the most powerful lessons often come from the humblest people around us. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel. Help us keep these important voices alive. We bring you true inspired tales of honor, humility, and humanity every week. And remember, next time you see an old man sweeping a floor or sitting quietly at a train station, take a closer look, offer a smile or a greeting. You never know if that person is carrying a piece of history on his back or an insignia of honor on his cane. Sometimes the heroes that change the world are the ones we've been walking past all along,